Okay, so let me get started then. So again, thank you, Donald, for having me on.
Pleasure.
Great pleasure to be with you here today. So I'm going to talk about cultural Marxism, a threat to society and the church. I just want to begin by mentioning Friedrich Nietzsche, the nihilist philosopher from the 19th century, 1844 to 1900. Friedrich Nietzsche declared the death of God in the 19th century. And he had declared that with the death of God would come the abolition of all moral meaning in the universe. There would be an abolition of man's centrality as God's image bearer. In other words, what he taught was that with the advent of nihilism and the death of God, men would be basically reduced to just, in his own words, in his thinking, man was just an animal who had needs and cravings, and men had no God to be answerable to. And so, what he basically said with the death of God was that with the death of God, this brought the death of man. That is, man as the center of the universe. And his philosophy of nihilism maintained that there was no meaning, no objective purpose to our lives or to the universe for that fact. And in his mind, everything had no meaning, nihilism, the philosophy of nothingness. And so when we talk about cultural Marxism, the first thing we need to understand is that it's very different than classical Marxism or Marxism, Leninism of the old Soviet Union. You will recognize cultural Marxism today by some of its terms, such as you'll hear terms like multiculturalism, political correctness, tolerance, inclusion, safe sex, sensitivity training, post-colonial studies, Aboriginal studies, African American studies, trans studies, and words like social justice, diversity, special interest groups, and also progressivism, which, of course, by definition, progressivism implies change. And by using these terms that are now being used in our universities and colleges, in our academic institutions, where people are actually getting degrees in these areas, that is, for example, people getting degrees in transsexual studies, for example.
Right.
And of course, we also see words like white privilege and words like the patriarchy, masculinity, toxic masculinity, and so on. Now, as I pointed out earlier, this is very different than the communism or Marxism of Karl Marx as well. It's named after Karl Marx. His dates are 1818 to 1883. And so what we find with Karl Marx is he believed that the problem to the world's woes was the economy. He believed that there was a class of people called the bourgeois. These would be the landowners, the factory owners, those who owned powerful means of production. He believed that the bourgeois were oppressing the proletariat, that is the working class. And he had spoken about the need for a revolution. There has to be a revolution of the proletariat, the working class, against the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie. And what he believed was that the bourgeois were the oppressors and the proletariat were the oppressed. And so the origin of this oppressor oppressed dichotomy finds its roots in Karl Marx's writings and his own philosophy. And so he believed the economy was the problem, that it was the means, the means that had basically subjugated people, impoverished them. The landowners, managers, CEOs were taking advantage of the workers and becoming rich off their hard labor. And he did believe, once again, that the only remedy to this issue, this tension, was to overthrow the bourgeois and to install a society where everyone shares everything in common, that everything is according to each man's to every man's means, his needs and so forth. And so he had argued that by getting rid of all these class distinctions, we would have this utopian world. And so we need to understand that Karl Marx rejected God as well. He believed that religion was the it was the drug that kept us drugged into thinking of an afterlife, a pie in the sky mentality. And he believed that we had to get rid of religion because religion kept people in this dream, this pie in the sky hope that you don't have to really apply yourselves here on planet Earth. There's a better world coming. There's a new heaven. There's a new earth. There's a heaven to gain. And so he believed that this was inhibitive to the progress of this utopian state. So all Karl Marx did really was he replaced the kingdom of God with the utopia, and he becomes the prophet, and his book, Das Kapital, becomes the Bible, and the Communist Party becomes the priesthood. And so what you have is basically the counterfeit kingdom, the counterfeit Bible, the counterfeit prophet, the counterfeit priesthood based on false premises. Now, of course, everywhere communism has spread, it has brought untold disaster and destruction and deaths everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're talking about China, Cuba under Castro, if you're talking about Cambodia under Pol Pot, even present-day Venezuela, which is now run by Maduro. But everywhere it has spread, it's caused nothing but oppression and, of course, inequality and starvation. So what we find then with Marx is that he believed that this revolution was inevitable. Now, Marx, of course, dies in 1883, and what happened in 1914, of course, with the advent of the First World War, many of Marx's disciples believed that the time was ripe for a revolution to occur. So they actually thought that this was it. This is the moment where the working class would rise up against their employers, the bourgeois, and they would bring about the utopia. But what happened in World War I is that instead of the workers rising up against their employers, they were actually joining the armies in the droves. Millions of them were conscripting to go and fight for their respective countries, and this brought a bit of a shock to the disciples of Marx. They thought surely this would be the right time for the revolution, but it did not happen. However, there was a revolution that took place in 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution took place under Vladimir Lenin, a disciple of Karl Marx, and he actually believed that his revolution that he had started would spread across Europe, but it did not go that way. And so under Lenin and then, of course, Stalin later, we see the effects of what communism does and Marxism. The first thing they did was they took all private property. And the second thing they did was they took all the farmers, starved them to death, at least the 6 million Ukrainians
Yes.
who were killed in the Holodomor. Now, we hear a lot about the Holocaust, but a lot of folks don't hear much about the Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian slaughter under started with Lenin, and then Stalin, of course, completed it. So Lenin then brings, of course, this Marxist ideology to Russia, and it remained there until the fall of the Soviet Union. But we also see that that communist Marxist ideology began to spread to other parts of the world. And so in 1949, you have the Chinese Communist Revolution under Mao. And then, of course, in the Caribbean, you have it under Fidel Castro. The same thing, taking property, private property, arresting farmers and starving them and giving and taking their crops and accusing them of being the thieves who stole the lands from the Cubans, and Mao said the same thing about the farmers in China. And then, of course, we know about North Korea, a very, very oppressive government there, where Voice of the Martyrs and and various Christian groups that monitor Christian persecution around the world, North Korea is the number one country where Christians are persecuted the most outside of the Islamic countries. And of course, it's that ideology that religion, again, is the opiate of the people and that it must be removed. Because you see, the moment you remove God out of the picture, then what do you have? Well, the only ceiling now that you have is the government. This is the totalitarian view of Marxism, that the government takes the place of God. And that is why in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is virtually worshipped as a god by his people. The propaganda about him doing things, feats of strength and performing impossible feats, the people believe this. They truly believe that Kim Jong-un is the next thing you get to a god. And so if you don't have a god, well then, as J.K. Chesterton once put it, people don't just stop believing, they'll believe in anything. And so the government begins to take the place of course, God himself. And that is, of course, the history of man, is that man seeks to usurp the right of God. It starts in the book of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, with Genesis 3:5, where the serpent basically says that you shall be as God or gods, knowing good and evil. In other words, you don't need God to be the basis of morality. You don't need God to tell you how to live. You can be gods yourselves. And therefore, you can become the adjudicators of your destiny. You can establish your own morality. And so that warfare has been going on since the Garden of Eden. It still continues today outside of Christ. It still continues. And we see the effects of that, where governments have tried to rule and they've tried to rule justly. And of course, democracy is the best form we have. It's not perfect, but it's, in comparison to all other forms of government, it certainly seems to be the best that we have at the moment. And of course, we also see in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was one of the most richest, flourishing countries in South America until Hugo Chavez introduced socialism and Marxist ideology there in 1999. And the effects have been seen, and they have been witnessed. The starvation that goes on. I have some friends who have relatives living in Venezuela, and they are under severe oppression by the government there. And so when we look at that evolution of Marxism, once again, what we see is this it's the same pattern. It's removal of human rights, removal of religious freedoms and liberty, removal of private property where the government owns everything. And we're beginning to see inklings of that even here in Canada, where you're not allowed to say certain things. Horvath just recently had a sign put down that basically condemned the transitioning of children, the sexual transition of children from male to female or female to male. And there was a group that put that sign up, a Christian group, and
Yeah.
it to be taken down. So the lack of freedom, government telling you when to go out, where to stay in, the government telling you what to believe, telling you that if you talk to someone who has same-sex attraction and they want to go straight, so to speak, the government has passed legislation, federal legislation, the anti-conversion therapy law, and so we are beginning to see here in Canada this oppressive move, the idea that our properties are ultimately the government's, and that they can take your property, they could seize property. So there's a lot of the same signs going on, and a lot of folks who come from communist countries to Canada are terrified because they're saying this is exactly what happened in our countries. This is what happened in Romania under Ceausescu. This is what happened in Cuba under Castro. And so all of that I've shared with you so far is classical Marxism. Now, what is cultural Marxism? Well, cultural Marxism is a offshoot of classical Marxism. And what cultural Marxism maintains is that Marx had the right idea. It was oppressor versus the oppressed. Where they disagree with Marx is it's not the economy that has to change. They argued that it's the culture that has to change. And they believe that if you undermine the culture of the West, then you can bring about the utopia. And so how did they do that? Very, very clever. The cultural Marxists, they began in the early 19th century, in the 1920s, and then evolved into the Frankfurt School. I'll say a little bit about that. And what we find is that there were two obstacles that the cultural Marxists believed that they had to take down. The first one is Christianity. They need to dismantle Christianity. And so their view was that Christianity is the basis of the Western government, the Western philosophy, the Christian West, so to speak, Christendom. And they believed that by attacking Christianity and subverting it, and also attacking the foundations of Western society, which are based on biblical ideologies, they believe that they could eradicate this patriarchy, ultimately based on God as Father, that they could undermine the very roots of the West and bring about this equality for all. This is why you hear a lot about equity. And equity is very different than equality, because we all have an equal opportunity to become what we want to become if we work hard, apply ourselves, study hard, and get the degrees and so on. You have that equal opportunity, but equity is very different. It basically means that you have the equal outcome means that everyone's the same, like a cookie cutter. Everyone's molded into the same. That is communism. That is precisely what communism is based on. It's the equality of outcome, not the equality of opportunity. And the equality of opportunity, I mentioned this in my book, No King But Christ, the equality of opportunity is based on scripture, where God mandated the work ethic, that if you work and by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your bread. There's the principle of hard work, and that if you don't eat, Paul says, the Apostle Paul says, if you don't work, rather, you don't eat. And so the idea here, what made the West great, is that you can become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. If you apply yourself, everyone has that equal opportunity if they apply themselves. And this is based again on the work ethic that God has established, and the fact that we're also image bearers of God. So cultural Marxism comes along, and you have some of the people spearheading this view is Marxists like Antonio Gramsci in Italy and George Lukács in Hungary. And these fellows come along, and what they say is, well, we need to undermine Christianity, because they believed that Christianity is the basis of the nuclear family, and in many respects it is. And they believe that by redefining the family, that is, redefining father roles, mother roles, and convoluting the meaning of these words, they believed that they could destroy Christianity, the family unit, which God also created, incidentally. And what these thinkers began to do was, whatever Christianity extolled, they would denigrate. And whatever Christianity found abominable, they would extol. So, for example, if Christianity said that same-sex sex or homosexual behavior, rather, if Christianity taught that those things were evil, then they would extol those things as progressive and being sexually free and unhindered. And they would emphasize the importance of love, that love is all that matters. And this should sound familiar to us, because this is what we're seeing going on right now in the West. And you're beginning to see the redefinition of words like mother and father. In fact, many legal documents, I know this in Ontario, they've removed references to father and mother and now have replaced it with parent, parent. So they've neutralized it to just parent. And George Lukács there on the right is the fellow who brought in sexual studies in the schools. And he's the one who came out with that famous saying, make love, not war. And he would introduce pornographic films in his classes. And this was meant to, once again, to undermine the Christian view of modesty, this idea that sexuality is a gift from God within the confines of marriage. And basically, he said that all type of sexual expression was acceptable, whether it was same sex, was interracial at the time, whether it was multiple partners, polyamorous relationships, and so on. So these fellows created what would become the Frankfurt School. But I want to share with you a quote here from George Lukács, the fellow that we looked at there. He says, quote, "A class accustomed by a tradition going back for many generations to the enjoyment of privileges and the exercise of power will never resign itself merely because of a single defeat." So I want you to notice the reference to enjoyment of privileges and the exercise of power. Now remember, these are the same words that are being used today about white privilege, and white privilege gives you power, and this causes you to be an oppressor. Notice that Lukács says this will not be done away with a single defeat. He says it will not simply endure the emergence of a new order without more ado. Here it is. It must first be broken ideologically before it will voluntarily enter the service of the new society, and before it will begin to regard the statutes of that society as legal and as existing of right instead of as the brutal facts of a temporary shift in the balance of power which can be reversed tomorrow. So notice his reference to breaking it ideologically. And the ideology that they're talking about here is the Judeo-Christian roots of Western civilization: the family, sexuality, God, headship in the family, that is the husband being the head of the wife and the children and so forth. All of that, he says, has to be done away with. It has to be broken ideologically. Now, they knew that this would not happen overnight. That's why it says it won't be because of a single defeat. They recognize that this is going to take years through the halls of academia. And so a lot of these Marxists were part of the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1930s, but with the arrival of Adolf Hitler in 1938 and then becoming the Chancellor of Germany, and then, of course, the beginning of the Second World War, the Frankfurt School, which were socialists, Adolf Hitler hated them. He didn't like the Frankfurt School. And so what they ended up doing was they actually came to America during the Second World War, and they set up shop in Columbia University. And because they believe that it's through the academic institutions that they will be able to break the West ideologically. And they're correct, because it is in the universities, it's in the places of thinking and logic, it's in the places of medicine and engineering, but particularly in the arts like philosophy and history and so on. So these Marxist professors from the Frankfurt School began to teach at Columbia University. And then they started teaching, of course, in some other universities. And it's no surprise that today, most of the professors from these universities, the majority of them are operating cultural Marxists. You will hear them condemn Hitler for the Nazi regime. You'll hear them condemn Hitler for the Holocaust. They'll even use the name Hitler as a pejorative term when they call Trump, for example, when they call him Hitler or a Nazi. You will notice that the Western academia rarely, if ever, attack Marxism. They never attack Karl Marx, or while they're toppling statues of John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, and Queen's Park, incidentally, just took John A. Macdonald out of the box. I was calling it Jack in the Box at Queen's Park. They finally took him out of the box there because the statue was being vandalized. And then tearing down statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, and of course Egerton Ryerson at what used to be Ryerson University. It's now the Metropolitan Toronto University. In other words, they began to destroy these statues, pictures, or symbols of our head of state or of our first prime minister. And this is how they accomplish the destruction of the West, by destroying its history. Dundas Square, for example, in Toronto, has just been renamed because of the alleged slavery trade that Mr. Dundas, of which Dundas Street is named after, and the town of Dundas in Hamilton. They've renamed it because they charge them with being a slave owner and a slave trader and so on. And so it's no surprise that you're beginning to see this attack on the so-called privileged white male heterosexual Christians. And so if you're white and you're male and you're heterosexual and you're a Christian, you are privileged. You are the oppressor. And so they will blame colonization on the West. They will blame the slave trade on the West. They will blame misogyny on the West. Everything that goes wrong in the West has been blamed on the Western white man heterosexual Christian. And of course, I'll say a little bit more about this, but they've created this self-loathing where white kids today feel guilty that they're responsible for colonization, slavery, and misogyny against women, and so on. And they're made to feel that they are less than. This is the unpardonable sin that can never be forgiven. This white guilt that they allegedly have. Now, we also see examples of this type of thinking in people like Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. And if you look at her language here, she says things like this: Slavs, Latin, and Hebrew immigrants are human weeds, a dead weight of human waste. Black soldiers and Jews are a menace to the race. Now, Margaret Sanger said this back in 1922. But this type of thinking is born out of this idea of well, it's genocidal, but it's based on this idea called eugenics. And why do I bring this up? I'm bringing this up as a tangent here because the first folks to practice eugenics was actually scientists in the United States. They were talking about eugenics long before Adolf Hitler came along and declared the Aryan race to be the Ubermensch, the Superman race. And it is actually from these American scientists that Adolf Hitler actually credited them with learning about genocide. He actually said he got it from the American scientists, and then he applied that to his own ideology that the Aryan race were the super race, and that all other races were inferior and had to be eradicated. And so here's an example from Margaret Sanger that certain human beings ought to be taken out. They should be obliterated. She also went on to say the most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. And so this idea that undesirables, that children should be taken out, that people should have the right to kill their children, all of this fits in with the Marxist agenda as well. Human life is devalued. It's all about the end will justify the means in their worldview. So the Frankfurt School, some of the folks there, I mentioned already George Lukács. I also mentioned Anthony Gramsci, the Italian Marxist. You also have other essential figureheads are Jürgen Habermas, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Max Horkheimer. And these fellows, as I said, created the Frankfurt School, named after, of course, Frankfurt in Germany, and their center for social studies and the idea of social criticism. This type of thinking arises out of the Frankfurt School. So all the disciplines we have today in our universities about post-colonial studies, Aboriginal studies, all of these social critical theory, this idea of social critical theory comes from the Frankfurt School. And I've already mentioned their entrance into the academia, into the academic institutions that have now moved all across not just North America, but they have now moved into Western Europe as well. And that is why, if you notice, we can ask our sister from Kenya, cultural Marxism is not an issue in the continent of Africa. It's not an issue in the continent of Asia. Some of my students at the seminary were telling me, some of my students from Africa were saying, we don't even understand what this is all about. Why is the West so obsessed with this ideology? They said in our country, we're hoping that we have enough food to eat for the day. And the same thing with my Asian students as well, that you don't find this type of thinking in those countries. Why? Because the Frankfurt School, the cultural Marxist movement, aims to destroy Western society. That's why in Australia, New Zealand, again, Western Europe, North and South America, this is where you see this type of thinking to undermine the West, because they know the United States in particular is the primary center of what we would call Western democracy or a free republic. The other thing that they did, the Frankfurt School, is they recognized that it was not enough to go into the institutions, the academic institutions. They believed that they also had to go into the film industry. And so a lot of them moved into Hollywood, into California, so that they could um, influence Hollywood. And so today, if you look at what Hollywood is pumping out in terms of movies and in terms of various TV shows or various episodes that you see on television, what are they promoting? They're promoting same-sex ideology. They're promoting, shows like Will and Grace. We're promoting this idea that homosexuality was fine. You'll notice that there is a constant attack on the family, that children are not born biologically as male or female. They're the ones who decide what they identify as. That's being pushed through the media, being pushed through the film industry. Foul language, of course, the idea that there is no modesty in words and thoughts. So the film industry through Hollywood has been influenced heavily by Marxist ideology, and of course our departments of sociology and philosophy and social work and our departments of various ideas, social critical theory, and so forth. Another branch of cultural Marxism is what's called critical race theory. And this, of course, has to do with the idea that the white people have taken advantage of Black people and that they have subjugated them, they have demoralized them. And critical race theory is an ideology that comes right out of this school. I mean, Black Lives Matter is an example of this. The leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement openly declared on YouTube, on one of their channels, that they are operating Marxists. They've openly admitted that. And yet, Karl Marx was a horrendous racist. He hated Black people. He used very derogatory terms of them. That doesn't matter to Black Lives Matter, because the idea is it's all about power. It has nothing to do with truth, because the leftist woke ideology, wokeism, social justice, it's all about asserting power. Truth doesn't matter. Logic doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. As Ben Shapiro once said, facts don't care about your feelings. Everything today is measured by feelings. You've offended me. And just recently in the United Kingdom, there was a protest going on at a protest with the Palestinians, and one Englishman just said, "We love bacon," and he was arrested for that because he had offended the sensibilities of the Muslims. But this is where we're at today. This is where we're at. And so the reason why I mention this is because the Southern Baptist Convention was going to adopt a motion to accept critical race theory in the church. And I've seen what this does to churches. I've seen churches here in Toronto fracture because the critical race theory comes into the church. They would invite people from BLM who are not even Christians to speak at church about how awful white people are. And they even had services where they would apologize to their Black brothers and sisters. And these are white folks who are just here to make a living and go to school and get married and have children and support their children. And in the meantime, they're feeling this guilt for something that allegedly their ancestors did. And so we've seen the fruit of this. It fractures the church. It's a sin against the body of Christ, where there is no Jew or Greek, there's no male, no female, there's no slave, there's no freeman, but we are one in Christ. And so this is why this is not just a threat to society, it's a threat to the church as well. Herbert Marcuse said this: breaking the existing universe of meaning. That's another way to say the destruction, as George Lukács says, to ideologically break the West. And so it's all about breaking the meaning. And so deprive words of meaning. So what is a man? What is a woman? A Supreme Court Justice nominee, if you remember, Jackson, when she was asked that question, her response was, I don't know, I'm not a biologist. And so a Supreme Court Justice nominee cannot answer a simple question, what is a woman? And this is supposed to be a representative of the highest court in the United States, in the Supreme Court. And words have meaning. And this undermines scripture. I mean, the idea of that, what was the first thing that the serpent said in Genesis 3:2? The first quote of the serpent was, did God really say? Hath God said? In other words, the serpent, the enemy, begins by undermining the meaning of words. What did God really mean what he said? Did he really say you would die? Maybe he meant something else. Maybe you're misunderstanding what God was telling you. And so we're in this Orwellian world, George Orwell's 1984, this newspeak, where you have a new language, a new vocabulary. And this movement that we see going on today, this woke social justice movement, has developed their own vocabulary, their own language. And so they'll speak about cis male, they'll talk about ableism, they'll come up with all these new terms. It's a new vernacular, it's a new speech. And so why do they do this? To undermine the meaning of what has been traditionally understood as men, women, children, marriage, morality, good, evil. And when you subvert the meaning of words, then what are you left with? You're just left with a relativistic view of the world, that everything is relative. There's no objective moral values or objective meaning in the universe. And of course, Che Guevara, who was an Argentinian who joined forces with Fidel Castro, this guy has been lionized in the media. You'll see his face on students in university will walk around with shirts with Che Guevara's face on it, and yet Che Guevara was a mass murderer. He also took homosexuals in Cuba and he incarcerated them. This is very interesting because this is something you rarely hear about among these groups that think that he was a freedom fighter. And yet he was a mass murderer who just murdered people who didn't agree with the ideology of Fidel Castro. And this is one of his famous statements. He said, to execute a man, we don't need proof of his guilt. We only need proof that it is necessary to execute him. It's that simple. So right in this statement by Guevara, you notice that the presumption of innocence is gone. The idea that you are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty is gone. It's not based on evidence. Evidence doesn't matter. It's all about power. Whereas in Christianity, if you remember, Jesus said to Pilate, when Pilate asked him what is truth, remember Jesus said that I have come into the world for this purpose. He said, I've come into the world to bear witness of the truth. And those who are of the truth hear my voice, because the truth is what sets us free. It's what makes us free. But in this Marxist, cultural Marxist worldview, truth does not matter. It doesn't exist. It's not objective. And that is why you hear these silly arguments like 2 and 2 is 5. They actually say that 2 and 2 is 5. And yet they will tell us that all these mathematicians like René Descartes and Blaise Pascal, all these great mathematicians, they're all white men. It's all a white privileged society, and they've actually charged them using mathematics as a means to oppress the minorities, to oppress the proletariat, so to speak, in Marx's words. So it's not about truth. Truth doesn't matter. It's about power. And yet Christ taught us that it's not about power because he had all the power as the sovereign. He had all the power if he wished to use it, but he didn't. He taught us that truth is where true power lies. The truth liberates people. But in this ideology, logic is chatter. It's meaningless. It's all about the end will justify the means. It doesn't matter how we get there by abolishing Christianity, destroying Christianity. Is it any surprise that here in Canada, in Western Canada, where over 100 churches were burned down to the ground, is it any surprise that the federal government did not react? Even Justin Trudeau said when he was prime minister, he said, while he doesn't agree with the burning of these churches, he says, I understand. And so he gives carte blanche to these groups that basically destroyed these churches, many of them belonging to Aboriginal peoples who built those churches and who buried their family there and who found encouragement and solace in those places of worship. Now, if that was a mosque, Trudeau and even Carney, if a mosque was burned down, just one, it would make headline news 24/7. CNN would be on it, the BBC would be on it, the CBC would be on it, because Muslims and Hindus and everyone else are considered oppressed in this worldview. Well, who are the oppressors? It's the white, European or Anglo-Saxon, heterosexual Christian male. And so you will notice that when churches are burned and razed to the ground, there's very little response to this. But when it's any other house of worship, it becomes a capital offense. There's a reason for that, and that goes back to this Marxist thinking, this cultural Marxist thinking. Even Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister for Adolf Hitler, said this: "A lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth." And so if you tell a lie over and over and over again, eventually people will believe it. And that is why today you'll hear people blurt out statements that have been repeated over and over and over again, even though they're not based on truth. So they will believe a lie. He also said if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it, and you yourself will even come to believe it yourself. So you can actually self-delude yourself. You can become self-deluded if you simply believe the same lie that's been reiterated over and over and over again. He also says it is the absolute right of the state to supervise the formation of public opinion. Now, this is important, folks, because right here, this is what I was talking about earlier, that the state determines what you should say, it determines what you should think, and it determines whether or not you should receive funding if you violate what it believes to be state opinion. And so what you have here, in the words of Joseph Goebbels, is statism. It's what we call statism, where the state is God. The state becomes everything. And so this is what we see in Marxist countries like North Korea and China and so on. And so once the government begins to tell you what you can say and what you cannot say and how to say it, you're no longer living in the land of freedom. You're now coming under this totalitarian, authoritarian ideology. And there's a reason too, because a lot of folks have asked me, my students have asked me, why is it that Americans seem to be so much freer than Canadians, that they hold the First Amendment, the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Why do they hold that to be so sacred? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that as Canadians, as we're part of the Commonwealth, we are not really free citizens. We're not really free. We are subjects of the crown. We are not a republic. In a republic, you have this idea of the Constitution and freedom of speech, freedom to defend yourself, and on and on and on. Whereas in countries like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, Commonwealth countries, really, you are really a subject of the crown. You make your oaths to the crown. You become a citizen. You affirm fidelity and an oath to the king and his heirs, and so on. And I'm not saying that constitutional monarchy is really bad, but what I'm saying is we have limits to our freedoms. We're not free citizens as in a republic. We are subjects of the crown. Now, let's talk a little bit about the slave trade, because this is one area cultural Marxism keeps attacking the church on is cultural Marx is that the church was responsible for the slave trade. Now, what they never tell you about, of course, is they never tell you about the Islamic slave trade that occurred long before the European slave trade, where the Muslims went over into the eastern horn of Africa and they took 140 million victims to the Islamic slave trade. And what they did was the the Muslims would castrate the males, the African men, they would castrate the African men. And what they would do is they would take the women as concubines, which is permissible in Islam. And as it points out there in the subscript, at least 80% of those captured by the Muslim slave traders were calculated to have died before reaching the slave markets. Slavery still goes on today in the Muslim world. It goes on in Libya. It goes on in the Sudan. It continues in Mauritania as well. And yet, in the West, what do we hear about? All we keep hearing about is how the English and the Americans and the Dutch and the Portuguese, how they brought about the slave trade and how they mistreated their slaves. Nothing is said about the Islamic slave trade, which still continues today. Why? Because the cultural Marxist worldview, Islam or Muslims are a minority group. They're an oppressed group, believe it or not. And so they don't mention this. They don't talk about this. And yet, who are the first people to abolish the slave trade? They were Christians. William Wilberforce in England brought a bill to abolish the slave trade once and for all. And it was a Christian with Christian convictions, with the backup of John Newton, the great author of Amazing Grace, and also the backup of the English reformer John Wesley, to see that we would abolish this practice in the empire, in the British Empire. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, the Americans shed blood over this. They died to set the slaves free in America. And so with the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, 1866, you have Abraham Lincoln with the Act of Emancipation. And so when we hear people say, well, the whites were racist and the whites enslaved, it was white people that actually abolished the slave trade, Christian white people who abolished the slave trade. Many of them were willing to die on the battlefields during the Civil War. America had a civil war over this. And so when we keep hearing this idea of slavery, it was abolished by Christians in the West. And many sailors in the British Navy went out into the waters and they saved and they actually rescued slaves from Islamic slave ships that were carrying them over into Arabia and or into Northern Africa. The Barbary pirates, for example, who went to the British Isles and would take white folks, that's right, white folks, and they would take them as slaves back into Northern Africa. And so the slave trade, which is sanctioned in the Quran, slavery is allowed in the Quran. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, owned slaves and traded slaves. These British sailors, many of them died in the high seas trying to rescue these slaves. And yet their families never received reparations. Their families were never acknowledged. Nothing is said about, for example, many of the powerful African tribes in the continent of Africa took enemy tribes as slaves and sold them to the Western Europeans. They actually sold them to the Europeans who'd come to the West Coast. None of this is mentioned, and yet slavery began because of the total depravity of men's hearts. And yet, cultural Marxism makes sure that the West is always bludgeoned with this charge that we're racists and we have misappropriated our privileges and so on. That's not the case. And yet to this day, Islam has never yet rescinded its claim on slavery. It has not abolished it completely. It still goes on today. Here is a famous sheikh from Saudi Arabia. He says slavery is part of Islam, slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will remain as long as there is Islam. Those who argue that slavery has been abolished are ignorant, not scholars. They are merely writers. Whoever says such things is an infidel. So even one of the highest authorities in the Islamic world acknowledges that slavery is permissible and will remain as long as Islam exists. Some of the other things you will also notice is cultural Marxists will tell you how the white Europeans came to Canada and to the United States and how they took advantage of the Aboriginal peoples. And you will notice that this is seen very clearly in the land acknowledgements that occur during certain events. I was just at an event at the University of Toronto about 2 weeks ago, and before they started the event, they wanted to acknowledge that they were on the land of the Mississauga tribe of Indians, and they were on this group, this group, and that group were on their land, on their property. And there is even a church in Toronto that I know of. I'm not going to mention it by name, but there's a church in Toronto that begins its worship service by doing a land acknowledgement. Now, the problem I have with that is, well, first and foremost, our land acknowledgement should be Psalm 24, verse 7. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God owns this land. This is our Father's world. The Lord owns all things. He has sovereign rights to everything that he has made. And yet, when you hear about this idea that we have to acknowledge that we're on stolen land, well, a couple of things come up. Well, if we're on stolen land, then we should leave. If someone's on your property and they're trespassing, you have a right to evict them. A lot of this type of thinking ignores the fact that many of these Aboriginal tribes, when they crossed over what many believe the Bering Strait, where Alaska and Siberia, they believe at one point there was frozen ice there across the strait, and many of them came into what we know as North America today and South America. A lot of these tribes conquered each other. They raped each other's wives. They cannibalized one another, and they were very, very savage, if I could use that term. You hear people talk about the noble savage, but that is a myth. When we look into their history, there is a lot of barbarity in the way some of these tribes treated each other. The Iroquois, for example, that you see on the screen there, the Iroquois joined forces with the French and absolutely annihilated the Huron. And the Huron are gone. And again, the Iroquois were known to be a very fierce, warlike tribe. And every time we make a land claim, well, what about those who were there before they came? And what about those who were there before they came? Can we go back to the Viking era? Where does it stop? And so what are all these landmarks intended to do? They're intended to remind you that you're an invader, that you're a colonizer, and that you are a thief. Your ancestors were thieves. And it's meant to denigrate. It's meant to make you, it is meant to make you feel less than. And a lot of these folks that do this, I can assure you, a lot of them, especially those in the universities, this is pure virtue signaling. In other words, what I mean by virtue signaling is they're pretending that they care about these landmarks and these land acknowledgements, when in actual fact, they're just doing it to look good for the optics, because they do it because they believe that by doing that, they're going to be seen as liberating, progressive, they're understanding, and so on. So a lot of politicians are expert at this. They virtue signal to get their way. Think of the Crusades, for example. This is another area that we hear those in the cultural Marxist movement, the woke movement, they will say that the Crusades were an example of Christianity's colonizing tendencies and their supersessionist approach to the minorities. And so the standard idea storyline that we hear about the Crusades, and this was really brought out in that Hollywood production, The Kingdom of Heaven, which was a terrible production. Even classical scholars who study the Middle Ages and who studied the Crusades, even they critiqued it as just a lot of it, they said, was just made up. It was embellished. It was not based on actual historical facts. The Crusades is touted as this malevolent Christian movement that went and took the Holy Land and killed Muslims and killed Jews, and they went and stole that land from the Jews and the Muslims. When in actual fact, if you look at the historical facts, the Crusades were not called until 400 years after the Islamic conquests. So Muhammad is born in 570 AD. He dies in 632 AD, and shortly after his death, his followers move out of Saudi Arabia and they go out conquering in the name of Allah, executing jihad, which is the struggle to dominate the world, to subjugate the infidels, the kafir, to submission to Islam. So they went out, they subjugated, they took over Persia, the Middle East, Syria. They took over massive parts of North Africa, like Egypt and Libya. These were once strongholds of Christianity. And they went as far as Spain and Portugal with the Andalusian Empire. And they remained out there at the westerly points of Western Europe, the farthest westerly point of Spain and Portugal. They were there until Charles Martel pushed them back. And so the Crusades, the first crusade was called after 1000 AD by the papacy. And the reason why the Crusades were called was to save Europe from falling to the Islamic sword, to save Europe from the Islamization and the colonization of Islam. That's right. Islam is a colonizing movement. Everywhere it goes, it Islamicizes the countries they take over. They teach Arabic as the language of prayer. They start to dress like Muslims. Their architecture becomes Islamic. Their flags take on Islamic symbols like the crescent moon and the Arabic creed of Islam, the Shahada. Um, and so the Crusades were meant to push back the Muslim hordes. They were threatening Vienna in Austria. They were also threatening to enter Rome. And so the Crusades pushed them back, and they also kicked them out of the Holy Land, because what they were doing in the Holy Land is they were coming in and they were desecrating holy sites, Christian pilgrim sites. They were desecrating churches. And so the Crusades went there to move them out. There were 4 waves of the Crusades, 4 different waves. And if it wasn't for the Crusades, Europe today would be an Islamic continent. If it wasn't for the Crusades, there would be no Martin Luther, no John Calvin, no Jan Hus, no John Wycliffe. There would be no Reformation, because there would be no Christianity in Europe. The Crusades is what saved Europe from falling to Islam. And if you look at Europe right now, what is Islam trying to do? It's trying to reclaim all of Europe, because the Islamic view is that once Islam takes over a certain land, even if they're removed, that land belongs by divine right to Allah and to the believing Muslim community. That's why they want to reclaim Spain. They want to reclaim France. They want to reclaim Germany. They want to reclaim Holland. And it's getting to the point now that even Britain, if you look at the most common baby boy name in Britain, is Muhammad. It's not James or Philip or Andrew or John. It is Muhammad. And if you look at the state of Western Europe, why are all these Muslim migrants flooding into Europe? Why are they not going to Saudi Arabia, or why are they not going to Dubai? And why are they not moving to Jordan? Why are they not moving into Syria? Why are they moving to the West? And why are the majority of them young men? There's a reason for that, because there's an Islamic doctrine called the Hijra, which means that if you migrate to an infidel land, you must migrate with the primary purpose of bringing that land under the subjugation of the Islamic Caliphate. And so the Crusades were a necessary movement to thwart the Islamic armies out of Europe. Transgenderism, this goes way back to George Lukács, and it goes way back to Herbert Marcuse, who taught that gender was meaningless and that really sexuality of any kind is permissible and should be freely expressed. And the United States had the sexual revolution in the 1960s. That is no mistake, folks. The sexual revolution of the 1960s is a product, it's the fruit of cultural Marxism. And what was the sexual revolution about? Free sex, free love. In other words, it was about freedom to express yourself sexually. You don't need to be married. It doesn't matter which partners you're with. It doesn't matter if they're the opposite sex or the same sex. And so this whole ideology comes out of this type of school, this type of thinking. And so here you have a young child, this young boy at a pride parade. And this same young boy, there were videos of this young boy in a gay bar while he's dancing, and these gay men are basically putting cash in his underwear. Just think about that. Now we have these children being exposed to nude men here in Toronto, and during the Pride Festival, there were videos that came out of men walking around completely nude in front of children, which is an indictable offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. Anyone who does that can be in prison up to 5 years, and the police did nothing. They didn't do a thing because they're under orders not to do anything. So now you have the collapse of law and order, you have the collapse of decency, and our children now are becoming the victims of this type of ideology. I mean, if you just look at what happened in Minnesota with that young man who identified as a trans person, he was male and identified as a female, and if you look at what he believed and the hatred for God and the hatred for Christ, this is the product of the whole cultural Marxist movement. It's to destabilize the West, and it's to undermine Christianity and the Judeo-Christian fruits of our nations. And of course, the cultural Marxists have come up with their own chart called the Matrix of Oppression. And you will notice on the far left there, social identity categories. People are not identified as individuals. It's all about group identity. And so you'll notice that under communism, you're identified by your group. And in cultural Marxist thinking, you are identified by your group. Are you the LGBTQ? Are you a white male or a white female? Are you a black woman, a black man, and so on? You're not identified as an individual, which is the image of God. God made us unique. Each of us are unique creatures. We're made in the image of God individually. And so the importance of the individual is removed so that the individual has no individual integrity or rights. You only have rights based on your group association. And that is why everything in this type of thinking is based on the group you belong to. And so if you look at the privileged social groups on the second column, isn't it interesting that the privileged social groups are white people? And according to sex, it's biological men, heterosexual. And so gender conforming bio men and women. Sexual orientation, you're privileged if you're a heterosexual. So what God created us to be, heterosexual, is considered a privileged group. And then you have the rich, upper class. And notice the Protestants are the privileged group, not the Roman Catholics, the Protestants. And then when you go into the far right, there's where you get the racism, sexism, transgender oppression, heterosexism, and then you'll notice the targeted groups, who are the minority groups, the targeted social groups. So those are the oppressed: Asian, Black, Latino, Native people, even biological women. But if you're a white woman, you are actually not as oppressed as a biological Black woman or Asian woman. Targeted groups: transgender, genderqueer, intersex people, lesbians, gay men, working class. Wow, where have we heard that before? Right, the proletariat, the working class, the poor people, people with disabilities. Notice this one: Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. Muslims are considered targeted people. I mean, I've been studying Islam for 40 years, and I've seen what happens in Islamic countries to our brothers and sisters, with ISIS and with Al Shabaab and with different groups, Boko Haram in Africa as well. And then if you notice there in the middle, you've got the border, the social groups. So think of it as there's these degrees. They call it intersectionality. These are the words that they use. And so if you're in the middle there, you can be transsexual, you can be gender ambiguous, you can be bisexual. Roman Catholics are in that category historically. And so this is the way it works. So if you're a white woman, then you're kind of in the privileged side. But let's say you're a black heterosexual woman. Well, you are in the targeted social group. But if you are a black lesbian woman, then you're even more oppressed because you're not just black, but you're also a lesbian. Or let's say you're an Asian transgender woman, you're even more oppressed. And so there's these degrees of oppression that they judge people with. And this is where we are today. This is where you get this idea of, white men need not apply and there are jobs out there where they clearly say that they don't want white male or female people applying for certain jobs. And then, of course, we have this idea that all cultures are equal. We're all equal. There's no, we can't judge one culture above another. Well, when we look at the Aztec people and the Mayans and the Incas down in South America, when the Spanish conquistadors, like Cortez, when they came to Mexico and various parts of South America, and they saw the Aztecs taking uh, enemy tribesmen and sacrificing them to their sun god by cutting out their hearts, beating hearts out of their chests, and dedicating their hearts to the sun. This was done in we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were ritually sacrificed this way. And so one of the things that the Spanish conquistadors did was they abolished this, which you would think is a good thing because you're abolishing human sacrifice. And who are these people that were being sacrificed? They were warring tribes. All of these tribes, the Aboriginals in Canada, Native Americans in America, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, all of them battled with one another and killed one another. And so when the Aztecs were doing this, the Spanish conquistadors were shocked when they saw this. They said, "You should not be doing this. This is murder. You're killing a human being made in the image of God." And so, what did Christianity do to South America and Central America? It got rid of this. It abolished this practice. And then, of course, when Christopher Columbus went to the Caribbean, and if you're wondering why it's called the Caribbean Sea, is the word Caribbean actually derives from a tribe that was in the islands down there called the Caribs, and the Caribs were cannibals. They were eating their enemies, as were the Aborigines in Australia. A lot of us don't talk about this today, but when you look at, for example, the Caribs, uh, they were cannibalizing their opponents and their enemies. And when Christopher Columbus arrived there, those poor folks who were being cannibalized, they actually welcomed him with open arms, because what that meant was, now that the white men are here, our lives are going to be spared. We're not going to be killed in ritual sacrifice. So this was going on with the Aztecs, the Mayans. The Incas would do similar sacrifices as well. On the right side there is the skeletal remains of a child that was discovered in a major excavation in Peru, where hundreds of children were ritually murdered. They found there was trauma, blunt force to the skull. There were broken pieces in the skull. These children were slaughtered, and they were buried facing the sea. And they found out that one of the things the Mayans feared was the hurricanes, because they would devastate their flocks and devastate their fields. And so one of the ways that they would appease the gods was by sacrificing children to them. And so they found this mass grave of these little children who were sacrificed to appease the wrath of the sea god, so that he would not bring about a hurricane. So again, are all cultures evil? I mean, were the Aztecs, was their culture evil? When you compare that to the Hebrews, when the Hebrews were offering up their children to Moloch and having them burned alive to Moloch, um, when the Hebrews came into Canaan, they abolished that, but then they started falling into that trap. So, excuse me, the Israelites started performing these rituals as well when they apostatized from the Lord. And so, would we compare the sacrifice of children in the fire to the legislation that God gave Israel, that you are not to let your children pass through the fire, you're not supposed to sacrifice them ritually? Well, of course not. The Hebrew religion that God had given Moses was far more advanced than the Canaanites and the Philistines and the neighboring nations. But today, I mean, when you look at the abortion industry, this type of thing still goes on. The only difference is it's a silent Holocaust. You don't hear the screams. But this idea that all cultures are equal is patently false. Patently false. Consider India, for example. In India, you have what's called the caste system, where you have various degrees of people who the very top is the Brahmins, the priestly class. And yet, those who are cultural Marxists believe that Hindus are a marginalized people. They're actually oppressed. But what they don't understand is that the Hindus that are the most oppressed are the ones at the bottom rung of the caste ladder. There's a group called the Untouchables. They're called the Dalits, and they cannot intermarry with others in the other chain above them. That is, those who are more privileged. And it's also based on color, by the way. The caste system is based on the idea that the darker your skin, the more inferior you are. So there's a racist component based on skin color. No one talks about this in the West. They don't talk about the inherent racism in Hinduism. That still continues to this day. So this group, the Dalits, they're so low on the caste system, they're not considered humans. Dogs are treated better than they are. They survive by doing the worst possible jobs. They work in cleaning sewers and feces and just the most just very very menial jobs that they do, and they can never come out of there. Their children are stuck in that caste. They cannot move up the ladder. They can't improve themselves. They may have the brains for a university student, but they'll never have that opportunity because they've been cursed to be in that category, being the lowest rung on the caste system. But all that to say that no one in the West knows about this except the scholars, those who study Hinduism. They don't know about this. They simply assume that the white man is the oppressor and everyone else is the oppressed, a process of elimination. But we see this going on in various parts of the world, particularly in India. And then, of course, you see our universities have been devastated by this. Professor Steven Pinker here is a psychologist, but he's also an atheist. He says this: universities are becoming laughing stocks of intolerance. And he's absolutely right. In universities, you are not allowed to say certain things. I could be fired for some of the things I'm telling you right now if I were to say this in a university class. In fact, I was warned by my dean because I appeared on a TV program with Rebel News, and I had spoken about the whole LGBTQ community, and I was warned not to mention my association with the university. So this idea that we are a tolerant society, no, we're not. Tolerance used to mean I will agree to disagree with you agreeably. Tolerance now means you have to accept what I say or else we're going to cancel you. So now you have cancel culture, where if you do something against the standard ideology of the party, then you're out. They'll cancel you. They'll do everything to destroy your job, destroy your reputation. And so what Pinker says here is absolutely true. Universities are now laughing stocks of intolerance. We also see how cultural Marxism has also affected the arts. I mean, art used to be based on beauty, the beauty of the human body, the beauty of nature, the beauty of the image of God, that humans are made in the image of God. Of course, we have the Mona Lisa, and on the left side there, you have the Pieta of Michelangelo, where he depicts the dead Christ on the lap of his mother, Mary. And if you look at the details, the beauty, the reality of sorrow on her face, and the dead body of Jesus, and this was meant to evoke thought. It was to be contemplative and so forth. Um, and you would have the beauty of nature that would be presented as well. It was about beauty and order. Now, what does art look like? Well, now you have things like Salvador Dali's Last Supper, where you will notice something very strange here, and that is if you look at the figure of Jesus in the middle, he seems almost transparent, like you can see right through him. This is deliberate because what is being depicted here is not a fleshly Christ, but rather a spirit, a phantom of sorts. This would be what we call Gnosticism, the idea that Jesus was not really a human being, that he was really a spirit who appeared as if he had a body. He appeared to eat, he appeared to drink, but he really didn't. And so here you see this idea of a spiritual Jesus, not a concrete incarnational Christ, but something of a spirit guide. You also see in the Guggenheim in New York City, for example, this is one artist that made this this toilet made of pure gold, this 24 karat gold. People are lined up to use this toilet, and the name of this toilet is America. He named it America. So that's what he thinks of America. It's just a toilet where you go and have bowel movements. So notice how art now becomes this, it's perversity. It's based on chaos. We see order with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. We see order there, but now art has become this thing that evokes anger and hatred. You see it as well in the left side there. This is called, and excuse my language, this is called Piss Christ. It was basically a crucifix that was put in a flax of urine. And this was called a piece of art. They called this a piece of art. So a crucifix of Christ on the cross in a flask of urine. Imagine if they did that with a picture of Muhammad. Imagine the consequences. What would happen if a gallery, an art gallery, put something like this and called it Muhammad? Well, we all know the answer to that, but it's open season on Christianity. On the right side, you have a depiction of the Madonna, a depiction of Mary, the mother of Jesus, but it's made of elephant dung. So all those brown markings there are made up of elephant dung. So what is that communicating? Something about the woman that bore Jesus Christ. So all of this is called art in the West, but they would never, ever, ever dare to do something similar in the case of the Prophet Muhammad, because they know what would happen to them. So what is this showing? It's showing a repulsion to anything that is Christian, which is the basis of our Western society. Also, literature has been affected by cultural Marxism. So the greatest mind in English literature is William Shakespeare on the left. And at the University of Pennsylvania, they had Shakespeare's picture in the hall of the English department there, and they replaced it with the lady on the right there. She's a black lesbian. They replaced it with her because she's the voice of America. She is the picture of the progressive nature of modern day society and thought. So out goes Shakespeare, and another reason is because he's a white man, but he is still considered, whether we like it or not, he is considered really the 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 founder, if you will, of much of the English literature that we enjoy today. Another area that's been affected as well is, of course, entertainment media. We all remember Johnny Carson, the good old days where Johnny was about laughing, it was about joking. He would touch sometimes on politics, but it would just be a laughing thing, impersonating President Ronald Reagan. If you look at the modern media types, everything is political. Everything is about attacking the president. Everything is about attacking the right. Everything is about undermining the Republican Party. Everything is about Orange Man bad and so on. So it's gotten so bad that some of their shows are even being canceled now. That's how bad it's gotten. And of course, we see the same in religion. On the left, you have, of course, our brother Paul Washer there. On the right, you have a Lutheran minister. She is an ordained Lutheran minister in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And she was actually invited one year by video to speak at World Vision Canada. That tells you where World Vision has gone as well. They've moved towards the left. They've moved into this woke ideology. And so now you've got ministers, people claiming to be ordained ministers of the gospel, going around identifying as gay and using blasphemous terminology. I personally heard this woman blaspheme the blood of Christ. But this is what our world wants. This is what they deem to be progressive. And of course, free speech. When you think of UCLA, for example, these universities were the bulwarks of freedom of speech. Today, freedom of speech is being condemned. They're talking about even they're amending the First Amendment to get rid of free speech. Not all free speech should be free, and so this is where we are today, folks. And again, under Marxism, freedom of speech is a no-no. It's taboo. You cannot speak against the government. You cannot speak against the authoritarian government that overrules you. And so you're beginning to see more of these groups like Antifa attacking free speech. Islam definitely does not support free speech. You're not allowed to criticize the Quran. You're not allowed to criticize Muhammad. And so under Islamic states, you're not given this freedom of speech. And then, of course, race becomes this major point of contention. They still claim, according to Newsweek, that America is racist. And yet, compared to other countries in the world, America is the least racist of them all. And again, the Civil War, Americans died to stop the slave trade, to stop slavery in America. And then you have this lady on the right there, a Canadian from out in British Columbia. She says, I have unfairly benefited from the color of my skin. White privilege is not acceptable. Well, then why did she not give her job to someone else? Why did she remain in her job? That's virtue signaling, folks. That's virtue signaling. Self-deprecation, self-loathing is what we see going on here. And of course, the Boy Scouts, they're gone. Now they're just called the Scouts. And now the reason for that is getting rid of gender. And they've neutralized it. And now you even got gay versions of the Girl Scouts parading through the Pride parades as well. All of this, everything was about honor with the Scouts honor. Everything was about honor. All of that is gone. It's no longer based on honor, which is based on love of God, love of neighbor, love of family, and so on. And of course, I've already mentioned the male-female binary. Sexuality is now described as fluid. Gender is fluid. All of that is an attack on the image of God. God defines his image by creating his image bearers as male and female. The first time the word male and female is used in the Bible is in reference to the human pair, even after the animals are told to procreate and so forth. And so this language of male and female is rooted in our identity as God's image bearers. And the attack here is on, again, it comes back to an attack on the king, the sovereign heavenly king. You undermine him by undermining his image, by undermining how he defines us sexually. And so that brings about of course, chaos. It brings about disorder. So having said that, Donald, I'm going to stop here. I think it's already 5:30, and I think I'm done.
Most basta,